storytelling in a sea of books on the long bus ride from school from her family's Western Nebraska farm. Then an inspiring FFA advisor appointed her to an Ag Communications SAE. Around the same time, a devoted journalism teacher pushed and said, "You can do this." She started freelance writing for regional agriculture publications while completing a journalism degree at the University of Wyoming. Since then, she's written and worked for Certified Angus Beef LLC, managed an award-winning weekly newspaper, and she's currently adventuring through self-employment as a storyteller specializing in agriculture journalism and farm and ranch photography. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Laura Nelson.
Hi! I feel so lonely up here. You guys are a long ways away. Do you want to come closer? You can. I mean, I'm not going to make you. I know how it feels when you're in church and you got to sit in the front. But I mean, it feels kind of lonely up here when you're clear back there. We got a small room. We'll have more fun together if we're close up. Here in the Amen pew. I love it. Okay, so I just want to get an idea of who is here. Who here is, is anybody here actually writing, you're writing your local histories? Yeah, okay, so we're working on compiling and gathering local histories. So a little bit, okay, cool. So that's kind of the focus here is we're going to talk about, I'm going to share some tips and tools that you can use, but I'm also just going to share some fun stories about our history in the Montana Farm Bureau. So welcome you guys. We're coming up close so we can all hang out together. Okay, so now that we're all close and we can see each other, can I share a kind of a weird secret with you? Is this a safe place? You're not going to judge me? Safe. This is a safe place? Okay. I love obituaries. Obituaries are my favorite genre of writing. And I hope that you don't think that I'm morbid in saying that. Does that sound like a morbid thing to say? Okay, it sounds like a morbid thing, but I assure you there are some Montanans here that will tell you that I am like as far from morbid of a person as possible. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, right. So I promise you that my love for obituaries is not a morbid obsession, but I really believe that obituaries are a lot less about dying and a lot more about living. Would we agree there? No. That obituaries are not stories about how people die, they're stories about how people lived, right? So that's why obituaries are my favorite genre of writing, but I'll tell you it wasn't always the case. The first time that I learned about writing obituaries was my freshman year of college. And we had an assignment to write an obituary. And we had to write our own obituary at the time. And it was a very formulaic model, okay? It was, here are the bullet points, these are the details of information that you have to go, and this is the order in which they go in. And so I kind of thought that writing obituaries were boring. I mean, really boring, okay? But then, as I grew and I got to grow in my journalism career, I started finding obituaries that had a lot more life in them. You guys read these kinds of obituaries? Yeah. I'm going to share a couple just because they're super fun. One, I found this, does anybody know what Mad Libs are? Who's played Mad Libs? Oh, this joke's going to be lost on a lot of us then. Okay. Mad Libs are the thing where you're in a group and you read a list and say, okay, tell me an adjective, tell me a verb, tell me a noun, right? And then you fill in the blanks. Okay, have you seen these? Okay, so this is the founder of Mad Libs, his obituary. Larry Sloan, co-founder of Mad Libs, has died. Larry is survived by his wife, Abe Lincoln. He was born in a bathroom and had a pet rhinoceros. That's fun. This obituary, I can't read the whole thing. It's hilarious. William Freddie McCullough, I'll read some of it because you can't see it that close. The man, the myth, the legend. Men wanted to be him and women wanted to be with him. William Freddie McCullough died September 11, 2013. Freddie loved deep-fried southern food smothered in cane syrup, fishing at Santine Cooper Lake, Little Debbie cakes, 2.5 Men, beautiful women, Reese's cups, and Jim Beam. Not necessarily in that order. He hated vegetables and hypocrites. Not necessarily in that order. It goes on, and later it tells us that Freddie loved to tell stories. You can never be sure, but about 50% of the stories were true. You just never knew which 50%. Later it tells Freddie adored the ladies, and they adored him. attracted more women than a shoe sale at Macy's. And then this was my favorite at the very end. Freddie was killed when he rushed into a burning orphanage to save a group of adorable children. Or maybe not. We all know how Freddie liked to tell stories. So, fun. Do you feel like you know how Freddie lived? Fun details tell you how you lived. This is one of my favorite obituaries. If you stuck around, and this is late in the obituary, if you stuck around Nelson Farms, Leland would surely put you to work for people. He always had a quick joke and a gentle tease for dogs, always a treat and an ear scratch. He was a never-ending source of quips that marked a good life. Be a good girl now. Do what you can with what you have. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. He played lively polkas on his accordion, dunked his cookies in his coffee, and instilled deep and lasting values in all our lives while dedicating his to the care of land, livestock, and loved ones. He'll be dearly missed by those who called him daddy, grandpa, and friend, but he left a little bit of his humble spirit, quick humor, and demand to do it right the first time in each of us. We know he's rumbling around heaven in his white 68 Ford pickup truck right now with a pile of waggy-tailed, smiling farm mutts riding shotgun while he picks up rocks, checks on fences, and passionately chases that one ornery cow that didn't go his way. That's my favorite. That's my grandpa's obituary. Details make a difference in telling people how we lived, right? Our lives are in the details, the beautiful, beautiful details. So now that you know that obituary writing, we know that the right details turn history into a meaningful story. That's where stories are told when we look at history, right? And I love podcasts. Does anybody here listen to podcasts? Yeah, podcast listeners? Okay, yeah. What are your favorites? Favorite shows?
Actually, that's how I go to church.
Ooh, I like that. I listen to a lot of sermon series on podcasts, yeah? Other good ones?
History of England.
Ooh, fun. I have a lot of people who are really into hardcore history. I can't... Yeah, is it Dan Carlin's voice sounds like Hannibal Lecter to me, so I can't ever get all the way through those ones. Anyways, I was listening to a podcast, and one of my favorite is Ann Croker, a writing coach. And she had a podcast called Write Your Own Obituary. It was a writing exercise, and it was very much focused on those same things, about learning to write stories that are about the details that tell us how people lived more than how they died. Her next podcast was called Write Your Own One-Line Legacy. And what she argued is that an obituary is for the generation at hand. But after a few generations, our lives are basically distilled down to about one line. That's about all that we have to be remembered for oftentimes, right? I mean, when we think of back into our family trees, we think of, oh, great-great-great-great-grandpa, he fought in the Civil War. Or that relative, they fought in the Revolutionary War. Or, ooh, she was the one that brought our family to Montana to homestead. And that's the thing that's left behind that we're known for. And she challenged her podcast listeners to think of our lives right now in terms of what our one-line legacy would be, and to live accordingly. That if we wanted to be known for one thing in our lives, how would we live each day to make sure that our ancestors knew our one-line legacy? So, these are the podcasts that I was listening to about the time the Montana Farm Bureau Federation started brainstorming what we were going to do to celebrate our 100th anniversary. And we talked about wanting to write a book and tell the story of our history, but a real story. Not just a history that was a formula of dates and details at times, but a story full of details that talked about the life that people have lived in the last 100 years. And so these are the ideas that I was thinking of, and so my great idea that I submitted to John was, we're going to tell stories about one-line legacies. When we look through our history of our Montana Farm Bureau Federation, what are the one-line legacies that our leaders were known for? That was my grand idea. Well, over the course of the last year, I found out that was not a super feasible idea for a lot of reasons. So today, I'm going to tell you about what I thought, what I learned, and then I'm going to give you some tips and tricks and ideas and research that I learned to help you research your history and your Farm Bureau background if that's what you're doing. So what I thought when I started a year ago. When I started working on this research project to write our book of Farm Bureau history in Montana. What I thought. When I started, I thought that I was going to get to define other people's one-line legacies. I thought that I would get to study these people and be like, well, this is what you're known for, according to me, because I have that authority. Then I thought, when I started, I thought that their Farm Bureau stories would be the most important part of their story. This is a Farm Bureau book. It's got to be all about Farm Bureau, right? When I started, I thought a legacy was something to admire. Here's how I researched, and we're going to talk about that. Number one, knock on doors. Can we all do that? Can you show me you can do that? All right, we're in business, okay? Number two, dig deep. Everybody do that? Yeah? I just want to make sure you guys are awake. I mean, it was after lunch. That was good lunch, right? Okay, number two, we're going to dig deep. And number three, we're going to read and review. Okay? So, when I started, I thought that I would get to define people's one-line legacies. I thought that I was going to do our history research and interview our current members and define what their one-line legacies were going to be. I thought I was going to have this really cute little packaged book. Like, I could see the headlines. I'm a visual thinker. I could see the headlines. So-and-so did this. So-and-so was known for this. And what I found is that I really just needed to knock on a bunch of doors. This is one of the doors that I knocked on at the Gasper's place. So, number one, we're going to knock on a bunch of doors. One of the first doors that I knocked on was this gentleman. His name is Tom Davis. Tom Davis lives in Livingston, Montana. He's the great-great-grandson of our first state president, John Davis. So, the thing that I found when I knocked on Tom Davis's door, and this was I just cold called him. I called him up one day and was like, hello, you don't know me. My name is Laura Nelson. I'm writing a history book about the Montana Farm Bureau Federation. Did you know your great-grandpa was our first state president? Can I come to your house and talk about it? Would you let me? Which I thought was really fun. So the one thing that he told me as we talked, I started asking him questions about their family and their family's history and who his great-grandfather was and what his involvement in the Farm Bureau was and what they learned from it. And he just kept saying, I wish that I would have asked my grandpa that when I had the chance. There was this tone of regret in his voice that said, it's too late now. We'll never get that piece of history back. We'll never get to know what his experience was because we didn't ask the right questions when we started. And this spring, when I heard him say that, that set the tone for my work and my research for the rest of the year. That it broke my heart to think that there are a lot of people out there who feel that about our organization, and that 100 years from now, I didn't want another Farm Bureau member looking back and saying, I wish we would have asked when we had the chance. I wish we would have known to ask the right questions when we had the chance. So that was my guiding principle that I learned, that I wanted to ask the right questions. One of the next doors that I knocked on was this here. That's John Davis too. So this is John Davis, our second state president. I'll give you the short version of this because I know time is short. This was an email that Tom wrote to me afterwards. Thank you for taking the time and interest to connect with Judy and I and to help me become more acquainted with my great-grandfather. It's so easy to view ancestors as citations and sources, but with your insights, I was reminded that these people really lived rich and interesting lives. And later he told me that he never felt like he was a real Montanan. I don't know, has anybody been to Montana? Do you guys know how much Montanans like Montana? Yeah, it's a big source of pride for Montanans to be a real Montanan, okay? He was fourth generation Montanan, but his great-grandfather, the one who was our first state president, and his grandfather, they both moved to Montana after they were born. So he was only second generation born in Montana. And he said he had always felt like he wasn't a real Montanan because he was only second generation. And when he found out the role that his great-grandfather played in our organization and the ways that he was a leader in the Farm Bureau and the role he played in the agriculture industry, he said, I suddenly felt like I had an ancestry to a real Montanan pioneer. And that was a game changer for him, which, isn't history cool? Do you agree that history can change our lives and the way that we look at what we do? So, the next door that I knocked on Harlan. He was our second state president. Does anybody know where the Bitterroot Valley is in Montana? The Montanans do. Okay. Awesome. The Bitterroot Valley of Montana. Mr. Harlan was our second state president. Mr. Harlan was a fascinating guy. He was a Union soldier. He enlisted when he was 16. He was from Minnesota. And by the time he was 18, he was out of the Union Army and he was traveling by foot to Montana. He walked to Montana from Minnesota on what was called the Fisk Expedition. So Mr. Harlan shows up in Montana. He panned for gold. That didn't pan out. He ended up in the Bitterroot Valley, and he planted the first commercial apple orchards in the state of Montana. Really interesting guy. Mr. Harlan, he had up to 56 different varieties of apples that he took to the Chicago World Fair one year to exhibit. He was best known for his work in developing the Macintosh apple variety, is what he was most well known for. He was a fascinating man. He was the first president of the Grange in his area. He was the first president and leader of the Montana Horticulture Society. He was the president of the Montana Fruit Growers Society. He helped build a local school in the area. And it was just one of the newspaper articles I read about him said, if there were ever a man who cared about the building of community in the Bitterroot Valley history, it was W.B. Harlan, Wilson Barber Harlan. He then went on to be the second State Farm Bureau president. And so there I was in the Bitterroot Valley, looking to knock on some doors. And the first door that I knocked on was the Historic Society there. And I was asking them questions. I did a lot of research there. And I like people. Can you tell that? I really like people. I like humans. I like details, real living details. Because remember, details are what make a story out of history, right? Details make a story out of history. So I was asking at the Historic Society, reading in their Journals of the West and reading his biographies, and I asked, where can I go to see something about Mr. Harlan's life? Where can I learn about his family, about his people? And they said, well, Mr. Harlan was also known to have built the first framed house in the Bitterroot Valley. Okay, can I go? And so they gave me directions. It's still standing, but he said, they're not very friendly folks who own it now. They're not going to want to talk to you, which was fine because when I knocked on their door, they weren't home anyways. But here they were on Harlan Creek. I found his house. It's behind those trees. And I kept thinking, there's got to be something more. What else can I do to learn more about the details of Mr. Harlan's life that made history? And so I went for a drive around the Bitterroot Valley looking to find some of his old apple orchard trees that are still standing there. And I ended up at Lake Como. This is right above where Mr. Harlan's house was, Lake Como. And it's rumored that he actually named Lake Como. Isn't this amazing to think these people, the influence, the mark that they left on these communities, these Farm Bureau leaders? So I took a picture up here at Lake Como. I happened to send it to a friend of mine, a dear mentor back in Big Timber where I live, and I said, no luck here, but I've spent a nice day at the lake. And he wrote back and said, what's the name of that gentleman that you're researching? And I said, oh, W.B. Harlan. And he said, well, you'll never believe what I just found out. I was telling my friend Craig, who's sitting on my back deck. He's from South Dakota. He happens to have a summer home in the Bitterroot Valley. We were old smoke jumper buddies together. And he says that he lives next door to W.B. Harlan's old house. And that they've been doing research about this Mr. Harlan, whose apple orchard is in their backyard for years. And they have a stockpile of great stories about him at their house. Why don't you go knock on his wife's door and see if she'll have you over for a glass of wine tonight? Okay. So I did. And I went over to their house, and she welcomed me in their house, and she set up a small plate, and we had a glass of wine on the back deck, and we looked out at the Bitterroot Valley and saw the things that Mr. Harlan built in his time as a farmer in the Bitterroot Valley and his time as a Farm Bureau leader. And I'm going to show you some pictures of, if I can. Let's see if we can get this. Is it easier to do over here on the screen, the play button? There we go. Okay. So these are some of Mr. Harlan's original apple orchards from 100 years ago, his apple trees that are still growing. And as Marilee and I sat on the back deck and we talked about him and we walked through the apple trees, she shared a bunch of information with me that suddenly made Mr. Harlan come to life. What I learned is that Mr. Harlan and his wife had Sunday picnics every Sunday for the whole community in these apple orchards. Oh, I thought it would play over again. Anyways, in the apple orchard, they would host community picnics in the apple orchard, and that the schoolhouse that they built, they had a daughter who was deaf, and they would gather other deaf students to come and learn sign language in the schoolhouse, and they had Christmas programs in the shed where they pressed their apple cider. And all of a sudden, I felt like I knew the important things about Mr. Harlan's life, which were, dang, it was really cool he was the president of the Grange. Dang, it was cool that he was the president of the Montana Farm Bureau. Dang, it was cool that he did all these things that built community. But what I know, and I learned from that night when a stranger opened her house to me and got to sit on the back deck, that the most important thing that he did as he built those community was built a place for people to gather and for people to be together. And I think that's the core values of who Farm Bureau is still today. Would you agree? I think so. It was good. It was so good. So here's what I thought. The other thing that Mr. Harlan was really well known for was he also sold the first commercial honey in Montana. Isn't this an interesting guy? He sold the first commercial honey in Montana, and he also sold his bees to the university so they could do research on apiaries there. And so I thought that it would be super fun to find a bee grower, an apiary in Montana that was doing the same things, because I thought that, remember, what did I think when I started this section? Anybody remember?
And you would get trained about it?
Yeah. I thought that I would get to determine what their legacies were. So I thought for sure, boy, he sold the first commercial honey in Montana. That must have been what he was best at. That's his one-line legacy. So I thought I'd find another bee guy that probably did the same thing. And I thought, well, that's surely what he's best known for. That'll be his one-line legacy, right? I thought this was going to be so easy. And instead I went and I met the folks at Smoot Honey. And oh, that's the same one. When I started, I thought I would get to define their one-line legacies. Now I know my job is to simply ask questions and listen for details. That the first job of a historian is to just listen, and to listen for the details that bring a story into history. So this is the Smoot Honey story and who they are today as Farm Bureau members. Get this little video thing figured out. There we go.
The wise man once told me that you make your own luck, and I think we've been able to make a lot of our own luck through hard work, and we've had favorable market conditions, like I said before. I hope that legacy of at least showing our kids how to work hard, and that, when things don't go your way, it's all right. You can still make it go. Like so that the fire that we had is a real big case in point. We could have just folded it up right there, and because it was devastating. It was our main building, and all of our equipment was ruined. And so, but that evening, the three of us, Dan, James, and I, while the fire was absolutely burning, as we're running around, trying to help whatever firemen, we would meet in the middle every once in a while. Hey, okay, so we got to make this phone call, this phone call, this phone call tomorrow. These guys need to know this, this, and this. Here's what happened. We got to tell our customers and some of our other, people. This is how it goes. So I hope that our kids have learned by seeing that. So it's a tough one for me. Yeah. Even though things can go really horribly wrong, it's okay. Yeah. If you work hard, at least take after things. You can make it through.
Did you guys hear that okay?
Yeah.
What do you think Smoot Honey's one-line legacy would be?
He persevered after the fire.
Okay. What kind of legacy do you think he left for his children?
Work hard.
Yeah. What do you think kind of legacy he left for the Farm Bureau?
Don't give up.
Yeah. Yeah. So I thought that his legacy was going to be that he sold a bunch of really good honey. I thought that's what a legacy would be. And instead, I found out that the most important part of a legacy is just to ask questions. So how did I do it? This is for those of you who are researching and working on writing your own histories. Number one, knock on doors. The greatest resource that I found were just humans. People that I could talk to, people in our own farm bureaus, people who are leaders in your community. And the first person that I went to were to find local genealogists in our county farm bureaus. I sent out an email to our state staff and to our state farm bureaus and asked, who in our ranks are good genealogists? Is anybody in here a genealogist? Like somebody who studies this kind of stuff? Nobody? Find somebody who is, because they are really interesting people. So I found Tom Davis by giving Sid Gable, who's a Farm Bureau member in our area. I said, I'm looking for information on this John Davis character. He was our first state president. I want to find out who he was, who his family was, what made him tick, what made him a great leader, what made him contribute to our industry in the ways that he did. And she zipped around on Ancestry.com and she came up with this little lead. She found the website to his funeral home and then sent me knocking on his door. Local genealogists, find the local genealogists, and they love this stuff. I mean, you find a geeky genealogist with a geeky person who wants to ask a bunch of questions, and it is gold, man. You're gonna have a good time, okay? Next place to look, local extension office records, okay? So do we know that our Farm Bureau history is deeply embedded in the extension services? Do we know that? Okay, so our Farm Bureau history is all locked up there. The greatest sources of information that I found on our early leaders were found in the annual extension agent reports. They wrote reports every year and they were detailed, and I mean detailed. Okay, and they talked about all the ways that their farm bureaus got started, and who were at the first meetings, and who the first elected people were, and what they did, and what their projects were, and what their budgets were, and all of these things. So I found those in the local extension office records. Now I found a lot of those. Some local extension agents had those records still. In Montana, we happen to be celebrating, the Extension Services is celebrating 125 years this year. So they had been doing a lot of research. So in your home states, maybe that's your extension agent, maybe it's at your state library, but those local extension office records were a treasure trove of information when I was looking for Farm Bureau history. Okay, the next one I would suggest is local libraries, historic societies, or museums. Like I said, I went to the Museum of the Bitterroot Valley, and as much as I wanted to believe that all of this information was going to be digitized and up there to find in the cloud, it's not. There is fascinating, beautiful, amazing information about our past and our histories that are nowhere else but your local library and your local museums. If you have, who has visited their local museum, their local history museum in the last year? Oh, I love these people. You guys are the best. They're cool places, right? Really cool places. They've got a great information about local Farm Bureau history. Your local insurance agent office, I found that in some areas, they just needed a holding place for these historic records, and the Farm Bureau members didn't have it, so they stowed them away at the insurance agent's office, okay? So if you're looking for information on your county local Farm Bureau, ask your insurance agent if they happen to be the warehouse where that got tucked away at, okay? And then at last, humans. Ask people good questions. And this is the best interview advice I ever got. Do some of you do interviews? Is that what you're doing to gather information? You interview people? Best advice I ever got in journalism school was to be a little bit awkward. You know when people say the very best things? About 5 seconds after they finish their last thought. And if we get too excited to ask the next question, we miss the really good things that they're going to say. So as an interviewer, when you're asking questions about history, the very best thing you can do is let them finish their sentence and then be okay with just sitting in silence for about 10 seconds. Because they'll fill the silence. If you're okay with being awkward, which I am, just sit in silence for a couple of seconds and they'll come up and share the most fascinating things about their lives that otherwise they may have hesitated to share. So stop, listen, get awkward. And I put some resources on my website. I made this one-page handout. If you're writing your local Farm Bureau history, this is a list of questions that I came up with that will help guide that conversation, okay? So, and I'll have that posted on my website this afternoon. It's just lauracnelson.com. And on the front side, I have a printout of some of those resources that we're talking about here. So that's a resource for you to ask those questions. Okay, so again, when I started, I thought I would get to find their one legacies. What I know now is that my job is to just simply shut up, ask questions, and listen for details. So, when I started, I thought their Farm Bureau stories were the most important part of this story. I'm writing a book about Farm Bureau history. We're gonna have a lot of Farm Bureau history in it, I promise. There's gonna be a lot of Farm Bureau history in there. This is John. He's our executive. He's who paying me. He's paying me to write this book.
Seeing if I got my money's worth.
Right. So I promise there will be a lot of Farm Bureau history in there. But remember, what makes a story out of history?
Details.
Details. Make a story out of history, and they're always personal details. This is my buddy Jack Lake. This is one of my favorite trips. And the way that I found some of these things was that I had to dig deeper. When you get to the end of an information source and you think you've used all the resources you can to find the information that you think you want to write your history, dig a little deeper. Now, I went along with Jack and Susan on potato harvest, and we dug pretty deep. You can ask them what a journalist looks like after a day riding on the back of a potato digger, because I think they would prefer that to be the picture up here. But you gotta dig deep, okay? So, dig deep. This is A.H. Stanford. He was our third state president, Ambrose Stanford. He was an interesting guy. He was our first state president. So as we know, the Farm Bureau movement went from a very local grassroots community effort up to the state, up to the national organization. And Mr. Stanford was the state president at a time when, at first, Montana declined to be a part of the American Farm Bureau Federation. They said, no thank you, we're gonna focus on our local counties first. We're not prepared to affiliate with a national organization. We need to make sure that we're doing a good job at home before we join into something bigger. So Mr. Stafford was the president right after that. So he was the first president that really tackled statewide issues. And they did some really interesting work. They were focused on trade issues coming out of the First World War. They were also focused on eradicating rust from wheat. So the rust epidemic was going through, so they were doing some serious work to eradicate that disease in wheat. So he did some really interesting things. He went on to serve in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He was the first Montanan to do that. Again, really interesting guy, full of like a big resume. You know, it's really easy to write history that's full of a bunch of big resumes. But who wants to read a book of resumes? Anybody? Anybody want to read a book of resumes? Nah, you want to read a book of stories, right? So what I found is, I found some speeches that he gave when he introduced the governor at the Gallatin Field Day. I found this great folder full of letters. You ever read it, somebody else's mail? It's fun, okay? It can be kind of boring stuff, but when it's somebody else's mail, you're ripping through that thing like it's a treasure trove. Well, I got to read Mr. Stafford's mail, and he had some interesting mail. I found his letters of recommendation when he was running for, when he was asking to be in the Agriculture Commission in Montana. He was apparently a great neighbor. He was a very staunch Democrat, the head of the Democratic Committee in Gallatin Valley. His neighbor was a staunch Republican, and his neighbor said he was the best man he knew. Don't you miss those days? I didn't ever get to know about those days. But he was apparently a wonderful, wonderful man. I found business correspondence about his business as a farmer and a sheep guy. I found letters from senators, not state senators, senators and representatives, official correspondence back and forth to the American Farm Bureau about the important issues that they were dealing with then. All of these things that built a really big, important, interesting resume that told a lot of important, interesting stories about the things our organization did. But guess what I was most interested in? Yeah, his story. Who he was, what drove him to do these things, what made him effective at the national level, what made him an effective leader, and what could we learn from that? So it was almost time to leave the library. The library is a very serious place. Did you know that? That's a joke. They put a facade on there that it's a serious, boring place. Librarians are fun. And libraries are fun. But it was almost closing time at the state library, and they were getting ready to shuffle me out, and I found one more folder of Mr. Stafford's after I had read through all this stuff, and I really wanted to read this folder. It was called Clippings. And I thought for sure that the clippings would be newspaper clippings of all of his accomplishments and accolades, which it probably should have been because they were huge. He did great things for the Montana Farm Bureau. And instead, in this folder called Clippings, guess what I found? This will just melt your heart. His daughter Charlotte's 4th grade 100% spelling test. Come on, man. And this folder was full of the things that I think, do you guys have an office at home? Do you have little pieces of paper that you've cut out and posted on the wall, taped to your desk, put in the junk drawer? This folder at our Montana State Historic Society was filled with those things. And it included things like his daughter's 4th grade 100% spelling test. And it included things like this poem cut out from the newspaper article. The thing that goes the furthest towards making life worthwhile, what's worth the most and costs the least, is just a pleasant smile. 'Tis full of worth and goodness too, and manly kindness blent. 'Tis worth $1 million, and it doesn't cost a cent. Do you feel like you know what kind of guy Mr. Stafford was? Do you feel like he's the kind of guy that you'd want to follow in an organization? I did. That last folder told me that Mr. Stafford was the kind of guy that I'd want to follow in the Farm Bureau organization, that he's the kind of guy that gave this organization staying power because he had a smile and he loved his family, and he did really important things for our industry too. So when I started, I thought that Farm Bureau stories were the most important parts of our story. Now I know the details of who we are every day teaches us more about the stories we share. This is Hans McPherson. He's our state president right now. And when I went to visit Hans, I spent a couple of days there in the Bitterroot with him and his family. And the one day I told him I just wanted a day in the life. I wanted to follow him around and take pictures of a day in his life to include in this history book. Because did you know that the things we do right now are tomorrow's history? Do you realize? Do we all grasp that? That our lives right now are going to be studied 100 years from now, like these people's are today? So I just wanted to document a day in Hans's life. What does it look like to be a Farm Bureau president today? So 100 years from now, our members know what he was doing. And throughout the day, first of all, we went and fed the bulls, and we were doing this and that. And then he says, oh, I forgot. I told this young couple from the church that I would help them move a freezer. Do you mind if we go move a freezer? Well, sure, I'll move a freezer. So we drove to town and moved the freezer. We came back to the farm, got back to work. We're doing something, and then he said, oh, I forgot. There's a young couple down the road that just started their farm. They're growing garlic, and they need some straw to bed it down. So I told him I'd help him load it up. Can we go help this guy load up some hay? Okay. So we went, helped load up some hay. A little bit later, we're back to work, and he gets another phone call. Or no, there was some commotion over by the hog barn. I said, well, what's going on there? Oh, there's a group of people who come out, the Hmong live in the Bitterroot Valley, and they come and they harvest a pig every once in a while for their cultural celebrations. Isn't it cool that they can do their traditional cultural celebrations here in the middle of Montana because they can come out and harvest a pig? Let's stop by and check it out and see what they're doing. He told me this great history about the Hmong in the Bitterroot Valley. Okay. So we get back to work on the farm. And then he goes to leave, and he calls me up as he's leaving, and he says, wait a minute, I just drove by my neighbor's house. There's a young couple over there. They just started a hops farm. They've never farmed before. They're hanging up their trellises. You should go see what they're doing and check it out. I said, okay. So I went over and I checked it out, and you know what they told me? They said that Hans McPherson is the best neighbor they've ever had, that he always takes time to stop by and help them with their farm and teach them about weed management and teach them how to prep the soil and teach these new farmers what they never knew and they don't have the resources to know unless a good neighbor stops by and tells them. And by the way, he got me signed up for Farm Bureau right away. And what I was so tickled by and touched by was that at the end of our visit, I was getting ready to leave, and I was thanking Hans for this time, and he said, kind of sheepishly, he said, I'm sorry for all the interruptions. I'm sorry I don't think you probably got the pictures that you wanted of us working on the farm, but we just were interrupted all day, and that's just the way life kind of goes. And I said, I think I learned everything I needed to do. So here's a little video of Hans talking about what a legacy means to him on a farm in the Bitterroot Valley.
A lot of people think, well, my legacy will be that I built this big ranch, you know. Well, if you sold everything from all your neighbors to do it, that's your legacy.
Yeah.
You know, if you helped your neighbors all along the way and built this big ranch, that's your legacy.
Yeah.
I think your legacy is what's left of it when everything else is words.
Yeah.
What do you think Hans's legacy is in the Farm Bureau?
Is a short attention span?
ADD.
That could be.
Generosity.
Neighboring? How else do we survive in agriculture without good neighbors? How else do we survive as a farm bureau without good neighbors? Without people who are willing to stop on the county road and ask how you're doing? Ask how they can help? Ask if they can lend a tractor? I think that when I learned a lot of those things, I learned that I thought their farm bureau stories were the most important part of their story. But what I know is the details of who we are every day teaches us more about our stories than anything else. That's the Farm Bureau story that I just fell in love with, that made me want to be a Farm Bureau member for life, forever, because I know this is a part of our history. So resources, I gotta give you something you can actually do here. Sorry, I'd love to stand here and tell stories all day, but dig deep. Remember part 2? Part 1 was, anybody remember? Knock on doors. Part 2, dig deep. Dig deep. Right when you think you've got to the end of the research, you pull out that last clipping folder and find the American Grocer poem that just melts your heart. State Historic Society. Do you guys have a State Historic Society where you're at? Do you know where you would find that? Probably at your state capital. The Montana State Historical Society was a phenomenal resource to me. And again, like genealogists, historians love when curious people come in to ask questions. Oh, they will have a good time with you. Real research, ask a historian, find a file. I had this ridiculous notion that I was going to go into the Historic Society and type into a computer and find all this information. And they were like, no, here's the microfilm. So, be prepared to just Is anybody else familiar with that sound? Yep, I spent a lot of time on that. And patience. Anybody know the movie, what's the fish movie? Finding Nemo. Just keep swimming, just keep swimming. Just keep digging, just keep digging. Look for more, and that's where you'll find the good stuff. It's like that awkward silence at the end of an interview question. There's always a little bit more that tells the real story in our history. Okay, one more section. Are we okay? Okay. One more section. Now I know the details of who we are. We know that. Now we all know that. When I started, I thought a legacy was something to admire. Do you agree? Agree?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I learned I was wrong. Okay? I'll tell you why. Here's how I learned this. This is Jim. He's a rancher out in eastern Montana. He was on our board many years ago. They have a cool family. They've got four brothers. They're all in Farm Bureau in different ways. But what I learned was when this last section, read and reflect. And reading, I'll get distracted. That's another story for another day. Anyways, read and reflect. This was my favorite character of all of our Montana Farm Bureau history. If you're researching your state Farm Bureau and you find a character cooler than Uncle Sam Hampton, I challenge you to call me and tell me about it. Because Uncle Sam Hampton is the coolest Farm Bureau character I have ever found. I got a little crush on him. He's a cool guy. Uncle Sam Hampton, he was a homesteader in Montana. He came up to Montana he was originally from Texas, then Oklahoma. He bounced around, he did a lot of cool things. Ended up in Montana homesteading in Dawson County. He was hired by the Montana Farm Bureau Federation to be their first state organizer. Uncle Sam Hampton, this is the guy, Uncle Sam, he made $900 952 speaking engagements in his 5.5 years as a Farm Bureau employee. How many?
952.
How many?
952.
952 in 5 years, 5.5 years. I did the math on that. 952 speaking engagements in 5.5 years means that he was speaking somewhere in Montana every other day, including holidays and weekends, for 5.5 years. I don't know if you've been to Montana, but that's some miles to cover, okay? In one day, I went from Libby, which is the far northwest corner of the state, to Billings, which is south central Montana. It's an 8.5-hour drive. There's still 6 more hours of Montana on the other side, okay? And this man spoke to 952 communities in the state organizing farm bureaus. I've never met anybody with more energy, and I never even met the guy, okay? But I could tell from his writing. So not only did he speak to 952 farm bureaus, organizing farm bureaus across the state in 5 years from 1918 to 1923, he also wrote a weekly column in the statewide publication. And he also, to tell you about the travels and how much he loved Farm Bureau, and he also was a homesteader in Dawson County, and him and his boys also were in the printing business. So he had a few things going on, right? But this man had more energy than I have ever fathomed. So Sam Hampton, one of my favorite, so his weekly columns, when I found this picture, this is exactly what I imagined Sam Hampton. He had rallies all across the state. Let's come together and meet Uncle Sam Hampton. You've heard of him, he makes you laugh, he makes you think, don't go it alone. What's the Farm Bureau? What can it do for you? Attend these meetings and learn. And he was the keynote speaker at all of these farm meetings across the state. And he preached the Farm Bureau gospel, is the words that he used. And he often rained down membership dollars as the sinners repented from their ways and learned of cooperation and brotherhood in the farming industry. He preached the Farm Bureau gospel with the zeal of a revivalist, and he called them his own tent revivals. I'm not kidding you. The man loved the Farm Bureau that much. And he preached that gospel. He brought it everywhere he went. One of my favorite stories about Uncle Sam is they were in eastern Montana, and they weren't supposed to have this speaking engagement, but they came across a livestock auction at a ranch, and they thought, well, here's a good chance to preach the Farm Bureau gospel. So they went in, and they found out they had about 20 minutes before the auction was supposed to start, and they gave Uncle Sam the floor to speak for 20 minutes. And the auctioneer said, not a minute more. Not a minute more. We've got to start this auction on time. Uncle Sam got up there to preach the gospel of the Farm Bureau, and at 20 minutes, the owner of the auction yard pulled 2 guns on him and pointed his direction. And he said, I beat cheeks out of there, but I rained down the Farm Bureau membership and brought their dollars along with me. It was a great day. He also tells a story about recruiting Farm Bureau members on the train in between speaking engagements. So he'd get on the train and find a bunch of farmers, and he just made friends with them. I mean, you could tell he wasn't a salesman. He wasn't a pushy guy. He was a guy that people loved to be around. He wasn't a slick salesman. He loved the Farm Bureau so much that he'd get around a bunch of farmers and he couldn't help himself but be so dang excited about it that the dollars, as he said, would just fall out of their pockets. Guess how much Farm Bureau membership was at the time in Montana? Anybody know?
$2.
$1. $1. And they just fell out of people's pockets wherever Sam Hampton went. Because he had an enthusiasm and an energy that brought people together and made them they couldn't help but want to be near him. They couldn't help but want to be in the organization. I tell you what, that's the kind of organization I want to be in. That's the kind of organization I want to be in for another 100 years. This is one of my favorite utterances and sayings of Uncle Sam. Let no farmer hesitate. Come to the front where you belong. Show your faith by your works. To dally is to dastard, and to doubt is to be damned. Uncle Sam had just a great energy about him, and when I think about members today, I think about this guy. He had the energy of Uncle Sam Hampton. This is Dave Mcclure. He was our state president several years ago. He was our state president through the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and we'll get to the video. I'll let the video play. Dave Mcclure became president at a time that was not so shiny in our Farm Bureau history. If you heard the lunch speaker talking about the farm crisis in the 80s and what that looked like to our membership in the Farm Bureau, it was a tough time, and it was a tough time for us as an organization. We were in debt. Our leadership was not in a good spot. There were a lot of relational conflicts in our organization. Things did not look good. We had about 3,000 members in Montana. And I'll play the video and then I'll talk a little bit more about this. And you can hear, so Dave Mcclure was our Distinguished Service Award winner this year, and this is a video from his award, which is a little different than the others, but it'll give you an idea of who he was.
Born and bred Farm Bureau. I mean, he loved Farm Bureau. He did everything he could for it.
We're honoring Dave Mcclure because he's probably as dedicated to Farm Bureau as anybody in the room.
Dave was the ultimate professional. He understood the president's role. He understood the staff's role. He understood the volunteers' role and understood that it was a grassroots organization.
He was always calm and collected, Dave. He just a dedicated Farm Bureau member. One of the things he reiterated a number of times when new board members became online. Now remember, if you go to a meeting and there's an issue, make sure you're following the policy. That was very important.
But Dave was always about what the members were thinking in the policy. So I think if I had to pick out one thing from Dave, it would be passion, three things actually: passion, commitment, and professionalism. So as far as Dave's leadership, he brought a lot of people in. He hired good people, and he was very enthusiastic.
I think he's as deserving as anybody in the Farm Bureau is.
We, as an organization, were probably not as high profile back in the day. We had fewer members, and the only way we got any recognition is if we were at those meetings. We had to be there. We had to be there in person. We had to speak responsibly, respectfully, and professionally. And Dave did that time after time after time. Farm Bureau, he did everything he could for it. Traveled a lot. It should be a family thing because of his wife. Joyce took care of the ranch when he was gone. And Dave was gone a lot. I mean, he traveled to Washington, other states. He gave us a lot of recognition, in the nation. So, well, I think when you see somebody that's willing to go to a meeting in Lewistown and get in the car and drive half the night to be at a meeting somewhere else, or attend a board meeting and get up in the morning at 4 and you get on an airplane to go to an insurance company meeting. That's the passion, I mean, and the love for the organization. Dave, other people, turn to politics. I think Dave could have done that, but his passion was in the organization and with the members in agriculture in Montana. Dedicated. He's dedicated to Farm Bureau.
What I heard over and over and over again as I asked people questions about Dave Mcclure and about his time as our organization's president when we went from about 3,000 members to, after his presidency, about 20,000 members in that time. What made the most difference, and it was the fact that he was willing to just show up time and time again, that he went to every meeting that Farm Bureau needed to have a presence at. He went to every meeting that they didn't even know Farm Bureau needed to have a presence at. He just showed up and he drove across the state and he lost sleep and he missed his family and he worked his rear end off to be a face for our organization. That's the kind of person that I want to follow in an organization. That's the kind of organization I want to be in for another 100 years. Do you agree? Heck yeah. So here's, well, what do I got on here next? I got one more story to tell, and then we're done, okay? When I started, I thought that a legacy was something to admire. Now I know that a legacy is left to learn from. That a resume is something that we admire. Remember when I showed you that list of the first obituary I learned to write? That was just a bullet point list of this happened, this happened, this happened, date, 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 name, name. That's the kind of legacy that we maybe admire. That's a resume. But a legacy is left to learn from. And I'll tell you, at the end of this year, so this book that we're putting together is these stories of these early leaders paired with stories of our members today. Because remember, the things that you're doing in your life today are tomorrow's history. So we wanted to capture our members today, because they're our history tomorrow. And I spent the last year, I put on 17,000 miles on my car for just business trips, for just Farm Bureau trips this year. And I felt a little bit like Uncle Sam, even though I know I didn't hold a candle to him. I know that I didn't even come close to the miles that Uncle Sam covered, and he was covering them in a train, which maybe that was easier. But anyways, I know I didn't even come close, but I know that at the end of this fall, I came to a point where I'd been on the road. I had been on the road for weeks. I got home really late. I've been trying to schedule this interview on a ranch that I wanted to photograph right down the road from me. And you know the things close to home are the hardest. And it had been planned and canceled and planned and canceled and planned and canceled. And I was kind of getting the feeling that this family didn't really want this strange photographer they had never met to come and interview them, which wasn't the case, but that's how I felt because I was tired and I hadn't slept a lot and I'd been peopling a lot. And I like people, but I had been peopling a lot. Do you know how that feels? You've just had to people a lot when you're used to just being on your ranch by yourself, okay? And I got home late that Friday night and they'd said, okay, we're gonna be shipping cattle tomorrow. You can come take photos of us shipping cattle tomorrow. And I got home late from a long trip the night before and I was this close to just texting the gal and saying, you know, why don't we just bag this? I'm tired. It's Saturday. I wanna sleep in my own bed for a night. I'm so exhausted and the weather is crummy and it's cold. And I just want to go to bed. And I'm not kidding you. I was like, picked up my phone to text her and I was like, but what would Uncle Sam do? Uncle Sam would get his rear end on the train and go to the ranch and meet the people and spend time with them because they're really cool people. And so that morning I woke up and it was cold. Oh, it was so cold and it was raining and I thought surely they're not going to ship cattle. Maybe they'll cancel on me. No, they're shipping cattle. And we went out and we had the best day. It was cold and it was rainy, but they're good people. They're good Farm Bureau members. They're people who love the land. We had a great conversation of what it takes to stay on the land for 100 years and 100 years more. Because did you know if we're going to have a Farm Bureau in 100 years, we've got to have people on the land in 100 years. And they talked about their conservation efforts and how they care for their water and how they care for their cattle and how their family's done that for 100 years and how they're going to do it for 100 more. And I thought, oh, thank you, Uncle Sam. Because what I learned is that I thought a legacy was something to admire, but a legacy is something to learn from. And I learned that by reading and reviewing. Remember what was the first one? Knock on doors. Then we're gonna, yep, and then we're gonna, I tell you what, I read Uncle Sam's biography. I met his family, I read his biography. I have a stack of paper in here that's this thick on Uncle Sam Hampton. I'm gonna write 500 words about him in the book. But I had to read and review. Farm Bureau Records, newspapers.com, has anybody ever used that? If you're a historian, it's worth the subscription. It's a great service. It has newspapers from all over the country that you can type keyword search, Farm Bureau, search in Montana, search for the years 1918, and it pulls up all the newspaper articles that have been used in that year, and they keep expanding that database every day. I get emails that they've expanded new newspapers are in, so if you're a historic researcher, it's worth the subscription to newspapers.com. Farm Bureau Records, journaling. Again, probably one of the best pieces of advice what I got when I started this writing project was from a friend of mine who's an author, and he said, you're going to get overwhelmed by research. You're going to get overwhelmed with information. You're going to get overwhelmed till you're exhausted. Every night when you get home from researching, write in your journal what the most interesting thing you learned that day was. Take 5 minutes at the end of your research day. If you're researching your Farm Bureau history, you're going to get overwhelmed because there's a lot out there. At the end of every day, sit down and journal the one interesting thing. This was a quote from On Writing Well. It's a book that I was reading last year. It says, that's interesting. If you find yourself saying it, pay attention and follow your nose. Trust your curiosity to connect with the curiosity of your readers. Whatever you thought was the most interesting thing in your research that day, it's probably what your readers are going to think is the most interesting thing. That was the best piece of advice I got in writing this. So, when I started, I thought a legacy was something to admire. Now I know it's something left to learn from. Brief overview. Anybody got questions? Comments? Fun stories to share? Knock-knock jokes? I love knock-knock jokes. All right, you can tell it to me later. Just a review. What I thought that I would get to define their legacies. I thought that Farm Bureau stories were the most important part of our stories. I thought a legacy was something to admire. Now I know my job is to just ask questions and listen. I know that the details of who we are every day teaches us more about the stories we share, because who's making the history of tomorrow? You are, right now. And how to do it. We're going to 1. Yep, we're going to 2. Dig deep. 3. Read and review. So, on my website, I told you I was going to have that one-page handout of questions to ask if you're writing your history. I also have a list of books that I read during the year, books that will help be a better writer, books that will help inspire ideas and help along the way. So I have those on my website, and I'd love if you had questions as you research your Farm Bureau history. Please ask, please share. I'd love to hear what you're learning or answer any questions. Knock-knock jokes? All right, bye.